Mr. Fleming, for my first question, I'd like to ask you about the Hudson River during the Revolutionary War. The Hudson River was of great strategic importance during the war. That was recognized by both sides, by the American and British sides. And in 1777, the British made a major effort to gain control of the Hudson River. Can you describe that effort on the part of the British?
This British effort to seize the Hudson River is one of the most important moments in the history of the American Revolution. If you look at the map, you see why the British were interested in doing this. The Hudson River, as it runs down from the north through New York down to New York City, really is the border of New England. And whoever controls the Hudson River could separate New England from the rest of the colonies. And believe me, this was something the British would have loved to have done, because they considered the Yankees the source of all the revolutionary turmoil that started the whole problem. This was a crucial border to control. And in 1777, the British made a huge effort to do this. They already had, they had seized New York and driven Washington and his army out of New York City in 1776. So they controlled the lower part of the river. And they could come up, they had a fleet there in New York Harbor, so they could come up the river anytime they wanted to. But the upper part, where they really would have walled off New England, that's what they wanted more than anything else. So their big effort began with General Burgoyne coming down Lake Champlain in an immense flotilla. All these redcoats and rowboats being rowed by the fleet sailors, and then 6 or 10 or 15 warships with them, and down they came to Fort Ticonderoga, where there was a completely dispirited American army. Their morale was shot. They hadn't eaten well for God knows when, and they didn't have enough men to defend this huge fort. So they took one look at this gigantic, it looked to them anyway, army, and they decided the only thing to do is retreat. And so they fled Ticonderoga, which was a stunning shock to the Americans. They talked about shooting a general. John Adams was saying, "We will not win the war until we shoot a general," etc. But it was a very good move on the part of the retreating American general, because he rescued the precious trained regulars that really the war depended on how many regulars Washington could keep in the fight. In 1776, I might add, when he announced his strategy of the war towards the fighting around New York, one of the principles, along with saying we will no longer seek an all-out battle to win the war in one battle, instead we will protract the war. The other principle was we have to maintain an army to look the enemy in the face. And he meant a trained army with cavalry and commissaries, and all the men are trained how to march in formation, all that. And these soldiers in Ticonderoga were trained, so they got them out of there, and they retreated down Lake George, and Burgoyne came after them, marching overland, and they fought Burgoyne to a standstill at the battles of Saratoga. There were 2 battles there. Another British army had come across the Great Lakes and landed at the head of the Mohawk River, and they were stopped by a combined militia and a regular army led by Benedict Arnold. So the British were thrown back on their heels, and then the militia from New England, some of the people who fought at Lexington and Concord, they came swarming out when they realized the British were on the brink of defeat. And Burgoyne had no choice, but surrounded by thousands, outnumbered now tremendously, he had to surrender his entire army. And this was really a crucial turning point in the history of the war. It brought in, the reason of course is, it brought in as an ally the nation of France. The French contribution to the war in the American Revolution was absolutely crucial. We could not have survived without it, because the country went bankrupt, and France then became our only source of money. And Benjamin Franklin became a miracle man, persuading the French king and the French foreign minister to keep sending this money. $40 million they sent us. That's the equivalent of $600 million today. It was vital, their aid. At the same time, the French were not solely interested in making sure the Americans became independent. They wanted them to be independent because that weakened the British Empire, but they weren't about to send their biggest and best army over to America and fight the British to a standstill. They were very interested in conquering other parts of the world where the British were powerful. In the West Indies, for instance, there were far more French soldiers were fighting in the West Indies than ever fought in America, because the West Indies were an immense gold mine, or better, an oil well. They made more money from what they called the sugar islands of the West Indies than they ever made from all the 13 colonies put together. And one sugar island could make an immense amount of money for whoever owned it. So this was a big objective. And then India, the British and the French have been fighting back and forth in India for a long time, and they were more or less kicked out in the French and Indian War, what we call the French and Indian War. It was really the 7 Years' War in Europe. So during that war, the British kicked the French out of India, but they got a fleet out there to India, and they had an army, and they had the Indians a lot of Indian armies fighting with them. They were hoping to regain their power in India too. So there was a lot of ambiguity and ambivalence in this whole relationship between America and the French. And some Americans, like John Adams, were very disenchanted with the French by 1781. He thought they were just keeping us sort of hanging on by our fingernails to distract the British, while the French were really making the conquest they wanted in other parts of the world. The truth is, thanks mainly to Benjamin Franklin and his incredibly good diplomacy, he kept enough of a French focus on America to keep the money coming. He got this 4,000-man army over.